pick up the next question.
All right, part two. No edits. Let's do this. So, you wrote a little article recently about the whole Meloni coming out, exposing the franc, and also giving examples of how this mercantilism isn't just happening with Africa and France, but also Germany and the EU, and then going as far as the US. And now that kind of goes into the like, can SOFR replace the FFR? So let's just like do that saga.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. So just to catch everybody up real quick, Giorgia Meloni, the new Italian prime minister,
Queen,
is awesome, and it's interesting that a 3-year-old video of hers where she was calling out the French colonial franc that they use in 14 of their former colonies over in West Africa. And it's been since revised a little bit since then. So now there's 2 different versions of the French colonial franc, one for 7 countries and another one for 7 other countries. But the mechanics don't matter because that came out and then went viral was, I think, the big tell, right? It's not that, she brought this up 3 years ago. It's important. What's important is that somebody in her group, office, or whomever, her ally or whatever, sent it out there and then made sure that it hit the right people to then blow up all over Twitter. And now, of course, it blew up over Twitter because, hey, Elon Musk has, taken the foot off the neck of the algorithm. And so now it can propagate. And so the thing went viral in a way that it would have never gone viral under, whatever the Parag, Aragal or whatever his name is. That fucking guy. So that changed a lot of things because now all of a sudden France virtue signaling about, Meloni refusing to take a couple hundred friggin' North African refugees after taking 60,000, I might add, in 2022. It's just insanity. And then the French foreign minister calls her an enemy of France and blah, 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 blah. And I've got my friends over from Mittelchino telling me, like, there's French there's French troops running around in Italian police uniforms in northern Italy at this point. Like, and I don't know how much to believe because, we're Italian and we tend to be a little histrionic. I know everybody's a little shocked for me to say that. But even if you don't, even if you don't believe Italian history, even if you do believe that we're not, we as Italians are overly emotional, but not necessarily histrionic, well, that's fine. Right.
Guilty.
So, and I get it. I'm as Italian as they come. So in that respect, at least, both genotypically and phenotypically. So, and then I'm a New Yorker, an ex-New Yorker on top of all of it. Now, so the war between Italy and France is real because it's clear that the French and the Germans are trying to, put the kibosh on any idea that the Italians can declare independence from the European Union, or if not declare independence from the European Union, gain a significant amount of political power within the EU. Now, that's one aspect of this. Now, so what is the significance of the CFA franc, the colonial French, whatever it is? It's the CFA franc. It's that this currency is pegged ultimately to the euro and also, by extension, inherits the ECB's monetary policy, meaning the discount rate and the deposit rate. So now, currencies should reflect in the aggregate, for lack of a better term, since they're all based on debt, and by extension, then the debt is based on the ability of the government to collect tax revenue based on the economic activity and the labor efficiency. It's in effect, connect 3 or 4 dots, and it comes down to it's a proxy for labor efficiency or capital efficiency within a particular country. So now, as dysfunctional as the European Union is, do you really think the Ivory Coast, for example, has the same labor efficiency as Europe in the aggregate? Of course not. These people barely have running water for Christ. Have barely have indoor plumbing for Christ's sake. And I mean, the last I checked, even the European Union can still make toilet paper. Like, right? Okay. I mean, they're an advanced economy, relatively speaking. So why should they have the same currency? They shouldn't. So they're saddled with a currency that's far stronger than it should be, and therefore it retards capital investment. It retards the ability of the country to attract capital and utilize what capital it has efficiently. It's starved of capital, so it can't do the things that it needs to do. And therefore, because of this, it leaves them in a vulnerable position, and it leaves them in a permanent state of having their their economy hollowed out and their wealth extracted from them. No different than when you look at the euro itself then and go, okay, well, we have one currency for all 19 of the members of the Eurozone. Well, Germany's debt is trading at, it's trading slightly lower than Italian debt, but Italian labor efficiency isn't anywhere close to that of Germany. And so if you didn't have the euro, the Deutschmark would be far stronger than the lira. Italian bond yields would be much higher than German bond yields as a market, a vote of confidence of one versus the other. And the minute that the Italian labor efficiency started to rise, its currency would start to strengthen, the bond yields would come down, there'd be normalization of credit spreads between the two, yada, yada, yada. And the bond vigilantes would be able to keep all of this working. But the bond vigilantes don't work. They don't operate because the central banks have taken everything over. So Germany has run ineffectively from within the European Union. It runs its own kind of mercantilist scam. The Italians benefit from Germany's bond rating and credit rating to issue more debt than they should to buy German goods at prices that they shouldn't be paying. And the Germans get to book a massive trade surplus and look like they're the crown jewel economically because they're trading in a currency that's weaker than what their currency should be. And so it's classic mercantilism. And then you add on top of that the EU itself writing rules for capital, free movement of capital, tax rates, this, that, regulations, all of these things that Italian businesses have to comply with, and they can't comply with equally versus the Germans who can, and so what you wind up with is, of course, the European Commission is dominated by who? Germans, because they have all the political power. So therefore, they can continue to raise barriers, protective barriers around their business within the European Union at the expense of everybody else's. Well, now, the big insight for me, I can't believe it took me this long to figure this out because I've been screaming about Germany running the scam on the rest of the EU for 6, 7, 8 years now. And it only dawned on me a month ago that fucking California and New York have been doing the same goddamn thing to the rest of us with the one monolithic Fed funds rate. Right? And it's a little different for us because it's not quite the same for us because we only have one issuer of U.S. Treasury bonds, right? The U.S. Treasury, and by extension the Federal Reserve. Whereas in Europe they have a worse system because it's even worse. It's more pernicious because Italy still retains its central bank and its nominal budget and yada yada yada. But the basic difference. But the basic analysis is still the same if it's not quite so dramatic or pronounced here in the United States, where California attracts the best jobs with the better economy. It stays there. Those jobs stay there. They have the political power to then write the rules in Washington that benefit their businesses as opposed to moving the business somewhere else. And for years and years and years, that's why the military industrial complex and the tech sector were all in California. That's why California politicians were so powerful, yada, yada, yada. Now, that only worked for so long until eventually the fiction of all of this, this unearned rent, this unearned capital, this unearned revenue that was given to California, extracted from the rest of the country for decades. They eventually squander it all because, well, they just think that the gravy train's never going to end because they have everything sewn up. They've got all they've sewn up all the vectors by which capital can leak away until prices get so cheap in places like Tennessee or whatever. And so the businesses in these old economy regions are so sclerotic that what do you think happened to the Rust Belt in New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio and all that stuff moved. And moreover, with the American with the Fed also running monetary policy for a globalist agenda, we sent all the manufacturing jobs overseas, and now the other countries that primarily want to sell to us relocated here. Relocated a lot of their manufacturing here. So the entire car industry is in Tennessee, Ohio, right? North Carolina, South Carolina. So many cars are made here. The Japanese companies all make them here, right? So they became destinations for capital. They became destinations for jobs. Their political power kept rising. Same thing with Florida and Texas and others. And so eventually the net migration of capital, is breaking down California, it's breaking down New York, right? But they ran the same internal mercantilist scam here in the United States in order to concentrate capital where they wanted there to be a concentration of political capital in Washington, D.C. No different than what they're doing in the EU with the European Commission. Same thing. So the interesting part about this now is that those old relationships are breaking down. As we reach the end of globalism, a lot of these dynamics are changing. And the buildup of Florida as a powerhouse, as the boomers all retired, and we became a consumer economy, people would rather consume the good life away from the goddamn snow. It's just that simple. It's not that tough to see that the money all moved south, and they wanted to preserve their wealth and say start cashing out in places that don't have an income tax, have more educational freedom for their grandkids, blah 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 blah. Like my whole family moved out of New York; they're all in South Carolina and North Carolina, and they're not the only ones. And now with the Trump tax cuts of 2017, which fucking Davos hated, because it was one of the biggest and best pieces of political kit ever to strengthen Trump's core political base. It created the migration that we're seeing today. It started the migration we're seeing today that was only then amplified during COVID. That, when Ron DeSantis stood up and said, you know what? Florida's still open for business. Everybody's like, great, I'm moving to Florida. I'm going to sell my overpriced $600,000 hovel that that I own on the outskirts of, San Francisco or $800,000 or $1 million. I'm going to go buy a place, east of or west of Palm Beach in the western part of Broward County for $300,000, pocket the difference, and pay 1/3 the money in taxes. I got news for you. When Tony Robbins wrote about moving out of California 5 years ago, he wrote an entire book about this. Tony Robbins, like as normie a guy as possible, that normies, that watch Oprah listen to. And he explained that he saves more money a year by relocating his mansion from California to West Palm in taxes that it literally pays for his entire lifestyle in a year. That's how much lower his tax burden is in Florida over California. And when normies hear that story, they get ideas. And now we're reaping the benefits of this now. And so these trends are not going to change anytime soon. Biden and Yellen are desperately trying to, raise the corporate tax rate. They're trying to tax normalize the OECD, using OECD rules to normalize taxes. They actually want to raise our corporate tax rate back up to 28%. Meanwhile, oh, by the way, France wants to lower their corporate tax rate back to 26% or leave it at 26.5%. Why? Because they want the money not to flow into the United States, they want to flow into France. And they're using tax policy to do so.
That makes complete total sense. I mean, it's just that jurisdictional arbitrage that
Yes.
people. It's just, it sounds too good to be true. I mean, it shouldn't, because it's just rational, and
Right.
people just act on their incentive. But again, this goes back to, it's like the downstreams of tight monetary policy,
Right.
making people shape up.
Yeah. Yep. It is. It's eventually, again, all of these systems, mercantilism always has a limit. And it's usually a pretty quick one. It's usually, good for a 5 to 10 year, boost. And then it collapses under the weight of itself as everybody, grinds out the arbitrage created, because everybody then devalues their currencies and puts up, trade barriers and blah, 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 blah. And then when trade wars happen, and then real wars happen. And then it's like the history of Europe. And so, okay, and then it's a race to the bottom, and everything collapses, and then every 8 years or so, big blow up, and then they reset the system and do it again. The Chinese are sitting there going, "You guys have been allowing us to run our mercantilist playbook for far longer than we ever thought you would have let us," and they got escape velocity. And now we're seeing the China hawks. Now all of a sudden, the resurrection of Kyle Bass is occurring again, right? The new him and Peter Sahan and others are like, they're doing the whole anti-China thing, and Steve Bannon is out there doing his typical, Office of Navy Intelligence thing that everybody forgets that he's a part of. Everybody forgets that Bannon was Navy intelligence. Same with Jack Posobiec, by the way. Just putting it out there. Fucking retards, these guys. So, when you parse all that out, it's pretty obvious that there's, we have to stop. We have to reverse the whole outflow of capital and manufacturing and everything else to the Chinese. Clearly. But we should have done this 20 years ago. But Davos obviously wanted China built, and they really did think that they were going to be able to run their same oligarchic, regulatory capture scheme on the Chinese that they ran on us, the Brits, because they were able to do it here in the West. So it should work for China, because human beings are just human beings, right? But they failed in Russia in the 90s. Well, they almost succeeded in Russia in the 90s, right? And then Putin put the kibosh on all of it. This is why they hate Putin. He cost them billions. He cost them everything. He cost them their agenda, and rebuilt Russia into a commodities powerhouse, and sent all the oligarchs either to the gulag or into exile, and then nationalize all their assets.
And how, I always forget, how exactly did he do that? Like, he used like financial rules against them, or he
just put them in fucking jail. And he just took Yukos and said it's a strategic asset that's owned by the Russian people and was sold off illegally. And sorry, no, it's ours. See, the same thing with Gazprom. Bill Browder and these guys were running around buying up the privatization coupons to get shares for pennies on the dollar, while Russians were starving in the streets and selling their shares of Gazprom for pennies, for kopecks, not even rubles. Like, go watch any good expose of Bill Browder and the scam that these guys were running, and you will be forever changed as a human being as to how evil and depraved these fucking people actually are. How does Bill Browder wind up in Moscow with a suitcase full of American dollars, buying tens of thousands of shares of Gazprom and Rosneft? How? She
I
was
mean, it all
backed by
kind of
Martin Armstrong's talked about this at great length. Go watch The Forecaster. Go watch Andrei Nekrasov's movie about Browder and the Magnitsky File. Go watch all of those movies, and it's all very clear that this was a massive scam. And Martin Armstrong, among other things that he's going to that we owe him a debt for, is his exposure of Bill Browder and the scam that was, the Edmund Safra, the Bank of New York Mellon, and all the rest of it that they and Rob, and even to another extent, Robert Maxwell was involved in this shit. Everybody was involved in it. So
yeah.
this is but it was the same. But they thought that they were going to, and they almost did run the table on this. They did actually get the shares, and then Putin just canceled them all and said, "Nope, sorry." Like, no, like, it doesn't matter. I don't even have to know what he actually did. It's just, no, we're not doing it. And they almost, they almost got control of everything. They were like this close to taking out Russia in 1999.
Yeah. I mean, which also kind of alludes to what you and Alex Craner were talking about the other day on a recent appearance of the USSR was basically a pet project of the globalist New York banks.
Sure. And London banks.
Yeah.
Don't forget
of course.
Yeah.
It's London has driven our monetary policy until this year. Yes.
Right. I just want to make sure that everybody's clear that it's not just Pepe Escobar's empire of chaos. Like, you don't let Perfidious Albion off and the British Crown off the hook. You just don't. And then their ties to old German money and old Dutch money and old Italian money and all this Club of Rome shit. Like, it's all the same people. It's all the same people. And they just don't want to give up. They just don't. And I don't expect them to. They've been running things they've been running things for over 400 years. And every time I use that phrase, all I can think of is Johnny Casper from Miller's Cross.
Yeah.
Running things. It's not as easy as it looks. My stomach's been killing me. God rest the soul of John Polito.
So you brought up Martin Armstrong, and you always say that he brings up a great point. Like, well, first of all, let's start with my, I guess I'll call it like shower epiphany. I was thinking about this stuff, and then I DM'd you, Tom, what if SOFR can replace the Fed funds rate? But then you brought up what Martin Armstrong says of like, well, there were actually 12 original regional Fed funds. So did we miss that in talking about the?
Yeah, I didn't even go into it. So let's I only like to filibuster for so long, and I get lost.
Okay.
So
yeah, going back to like the mercantilism between like New York and California and using that monetary policy to expropriate.
Well, the thing is that originally, as Martin Armstrong pointed out a while ago, he was, and banging his shoe on the table like Khrushchev, and trying to yell at all the gold bugs and all the Austrians like myself and others, saying, "Look, y'all blame the Fed for everything, but the Fed's not the only source of the problem."
It's fiscal.
Originally, the Fed was really just designed to be a source of temporary liquidity during monetary spasms. And we had 12 regional Fed banks. We still have 12 regional Fed banks, right? Minneapolis, Atlanta, Dallas, New York, San Francisco, right? And St. Louis, right? We have all these regional banks, and originally, individually, they all set individual interest rates for their regions, so that if money demand in San Francisco, because Raytheon was building a new freaking plant, or and all this capital being attracted to California, the cost of capital in California would rise. Fed would set interest rates in a Keynesian way. It would try and slow the economy down by raising interest rates and forcing the cost of capital up, thereby allowing the Atlanta Fed, for example, if activity was low, to keep interest rates a little lower, half a point lower, whatever. We had regional interest rates here in the United States. It's anathema to everybody because it's always been one monolithic rate. And we can thank, I don't remember when that changed. I think it was during World War II. I think it was during FDR when all the bad shit happened. So with a monolithic singular Fed funds rate, which New York dominated for years, but again, New York dominated the Federal Reserve, even from the outset. So even though Martin likes to talk, wax, eloquently about the structure of the Fed, it's still a monstrous organization because it was always going to be subject to the levels of corruption that we saw in the Fed. The Fed was always going to wind up having New York set monetary policy for the entire United States. Okay, it was always going to happen. New York and San Francisco got together and they colluded and they forced everybody else's, business on them, right? So it was eventually going to happen anyway. So the whole idea that the Fed is, not to blame is that's apologia on Martin's part. And I'm going to argue, and if I ever get into this in the same conversation with him, I'm going to say that exact thing to him because it's apologia. It's bullshit. It's nonsense. It's a system that is designed to ingrain a vector of corruption in something that we should not have vectors of corruption set in stone on. This is an institution that is wrong from a human freedom, a human liberty perspective, period. But it's the world we have, not the world we want, right? So the world we've got is that we've got this crappy version of the Federal Reserve. So now let's think about what goes on with and what actually helped drive New York and San Francisco to create the monolithic Fed funds rate. Well, it was the fact that all of our debt was indexed to LIBOR. So we were already getting taking our monetary policy cues from another source, which was that rate. And sure, there's money, so yeah, sure, loans in Mississippi would go off at a lower premium or even a discount to LIBOR than they would say in California or New York or whatever. Fine, yeah, but please, we're talking pittance here, not when they also control the fiscal side of things and how the money is spent fiscally. So the money was never going to go to Mississippi. What goes to Mississippi is welfare, keeping the labor efficiency poor, it's not capital that's going to pull Mississippi out of a 200-year freaking depression, which is what the state's been in relative to California. No, all the money went to California. Okay, that's just reality. So they were the beneficiaries of the free money. Well, with a singular debt indexing rate that's not based on market transactions like LIBOR, then clearly if we get rid of that, then the possibility for the regionalization of interest rates in the United States is on the table because we now have that with our own market-driven collateralized rate called SOFR, SOFR, otherwise known as a secured overnight financing. And so this is the thing that's now, undergirding our debt markets. And then there comes a day where if it's market-driven, internally based on what's happening in real transactions and between real banks and real players in the United States, then what do we need a Fed funds rate for? And maybe, just maybe, what we're seeing from Powell is the desire to actually to start the groundwork of laying the groundwork, the foundation for the eventual doing away with the Fed funds rate, because we're going to have a re-regionalization of debt indexing and the cost of capital within the United States. It could also be telling you that this process of decentralizing the interest rates is necessary because there's a competing asset out there that no one can deal with, Bitcoin or gold, and that the political system that's propped this whole rotten system up is also under multi-vector attack and is going to die anyway. So what's the best way to prep the markets for the catastrophic breakdown of the United States? But the re-regionalization of interest rates so that money markets locally are far more responsive to local business. So that if there's a political shock. There's not as much of a concomitant monetary shock locally. And then we have a situation that's similar, now that I think about it off the top of my head, similar to the way Buchanan handled the Panic of 1857 rather than the way we handled the great financial crisis of 2008, which is where Buchanan just shored up the local banks with specie and let everybody else, figure it out. In this next crisis, we may not see the Fed necessarily bail everybody out, but the banks will have to go to the discount window to get temporary liquidity and do what they need to do. And yeah, they'll have to wear the scarlet letter mark of shame, and there will be major banks that go under, while the regional banks, who no longer have to take their cues from other people as much. Yeah, we'll see what happens. It would be interesting to see if the Fed winds up having to take their monetary policy cues from what they're seeing in the SOFR markets. And we've seen this even a little bit, because when Powell raised the reverse repo rate by 5 basis points above the Fed funds rate last year, which was my aha moment, right? I'm gonna tie some other dots together. Jeff Snyder,
We have 7 minutes.
The Lumber Partners, wrote a very interesting piece talking about how Powell had to raise the RRP rate 5 basis points above. He had to do something because there was so much dollar demand that the money market rates were the 1 month T-bill rates were threatening to go negative. They were literally pegged at the zero bound, and they were pegged at the zero bound so far and for so long that Powell actually had no idea what the actual rate was, because it couldn't go negative, because we're the reserve currency of the world, so we couldn't let it go negative. So what Snyder said then, and this I agree with Jeff about, is that Powell raised the reverse repo rate by 5 basis points in order to uncover what the actual demand was for the dollar. And for the first few weeks after he did that, the T-bill rate moved, the 1 month or the 14, or whatever, the short-term T-bill rate moved back up, the short end of the yield curve moved back up to positive 3.5 basis points. Meaning there was 1.5 basis points worth of unmet demand in the US money markets at that moment in time. And that's why he raised 5 basis points. And now you can look at the way SOFR trades, and you can see it moves a couple of basis points above the floor of the Fed funds rate. It's trading right now, the SOFR quoted at 3.82 the other day, which is 7 basis points above the floor of the Fed funds rate. So is that part of the reason why Powell was so dovish yesterday? Because it's the first time I've seen it actually make it above the reverse repo payout, which is 5 basis points above the Fed floor. Fed's paying 3.8%. SOFR's now at 3.82. Was that why? Is that the new signal? I'm literally vamping about this right now. I'm literally putting all of these things are popping into my head as I speak. These aren't prepared remarks, guys. This is just me like trying to read what's going on. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah. Amazing what actual markets can accomplish, though.
Right. It's amazing what happens when you wind up with enough tools to actually allow markets to start expressing themselves. And so what that means is maybe there's actually more stress in the money markets than we've seen in 2 years in the United States, which is why Powell had to kind of back off a little bit and say, okay, I've started to break things domestically. I can back off, give everybody a lifeline. Does that mean that Lagarde gets a longer lifeline at the ECB? Sure, it does. But he's still going to raise 50 basis points on in 2 weeks from now. So that still puts 50 basis points worth of pressure on her.
Yeah, and which also means that he doesn't have to raise as aggressively because the amount that he has raised has worked.
Well, yeah, there's that as well. It's not just that, but he's already done so much damage. He doesn't have to.
It's like,
even if he
work here's done.
Yeah, even if he were to say, my work here is done, I can do this job from home now, right?
Yeah. I still like to see 6%
He's still
though,
done so much more work than anybody ever expected him to do this year. Remember, we were all this time last year, we were talking, well, if the Fed does start to raise rates, maybe they'll do, 7 quarter points. We'll be at 1.5% by the end of the year. He might have to give one back. And here we are at 4%, looking at 4.5%. And everybody's going, well, Powell just pivoted, man. You're wrong. I'm like, fuck off. Like, I have patrons saying this shit to me, and I literally want to say to them, like,
dude,
fuck off. Like,
I'm
seriously.
I'm
like,
slamming my head.
So done with it. Like, this is every once in a while, Phil. I go on the rant where I'm like, I need to fire the 10% of my worst patron, like my worst customers. It's at moments like this that I actually want to go on that rant again.
Dude, yes, like I'm looking at the server and I'm just like slamming my head against the wall. I was like, so y'all been here longer than me, but you're still saying this shit? Like, what don't you get, or are you in denial? Like, did you have a bad trade this week? Like, what's your fucking deal?
I know. Like, come on, man. Like, come on. It's not,
come on, man.
It's nothing goes. I mean, Powell could look, Phil. Powell could raise 25 basis points in 2 weeks, and he would still have already done 90% of the damage to these markets that he intended to do. Okay, it's a perception. Now, again, I say all the time, markets run on momentum and sentiment, not on fundamentals. But the fundamentals are that the Fed funds rate is at 4.25%, and used car loans are 11. Okay, anybody gone shopped? If you have less than 7, okay, let me. It's funny. I know this because I just went through and
Tom. So like real quick, we got like a minute left. So let's shut this one down. I'll send you another link and then we'll wrap it up on the other end. Sound good?
Sure, sounds good. Yep.
All right, we'll be right back, folks.